On the English. This may seem strange, since clearly I am at least part English myself, and how can I learn about myself and about the world from a study of the English? If you look at it as an encounter, how is it that I'm encountering it, since I actually am born and brought up as an English person? Well, the way I explain it to myself is that I am distanced from the English, not merely by the fact that I'm 5/8 Scottish, but by two things in particular. One is my birth and my first 5 years, which were spent, although inside the British Empire in Assam on the borders of India, but at a long way away from central core English society. That means that when I came back to England in 1947, though obviously I didn't talk about it like this, I had some kind of culture shock. Much of what I'd taken for granted as how the world works in imperial India, post-war India, was absent in England, and other things that were absent there were present. And so I had to learn the customs and the culture, the behaviour of a half unfamiliar, half familiar society. And the same kind of shock or distancing occurred later when, partly searching for those roots again, I went out to Nepal and started on many years of travel and anthropology with my wife Sarah in civilizations which were not English. India, obviously, Nepal, and then Japan, and then China, and many other places. And from each of them I looked back on this country and saw things about it which you wouldn't see if you just stayed within it. And I learnt a huge amount from this. I suppose the overarching thing I learnt about myself and about the world was that the English, as I've put it in the title of the book, are very peculiar, the peculiarity of the English. I'd taken it for granted, I suppose, as I grew up as a schoolboy and boarding school boy, which was another culture shock, that I was normal and the rest of the world was a bit odd. And that is the general attitude of people within civilizations. They take their world as the normal rule and the rest as exceptions. But as I looked around the world, travelled around the world, and became an anthropologist and taught about all different civilizations and cultures, I realized that was not right. I realized that what had happened and grown up on this particular island over time was very unusual, and that's why it gave birth to the first industrial revolution, the huge turning point in human history which changed our world from a basically agricultural one to an industrial one. That happened on a very peculiar island, and many people whose accounts I read, who'd come from France or further afield, said that they found the English strange and odd. So what is it about the English which I learnt was strange and odd, and other people have commented on as well? Well, there's so many things, and they're in a number of my books. I'll just pick out one or two. One was the sense of humour, that the English constantly seemed to be making jokes about things. They didn't seem to take things enormously seriously, even the most important things. And also that their humour was of a peculiar kind. It was a play on language in which, in its purest form, which was irony, you said one thing and you meant the opposite. And that implied that the people using that and receiving it understood the hidden text as well as the formal text. So you would exaggerate, you'd say, this is the most fantastic baked beans I've ever eaten in my life. and everyone knew that it was absolutely lousy baked beans, and so on. So the great ironists and satirists like Alexander Pope and John Dryden, and later Oscar Wilde and so on, were playing with this kind of humour, and that was very distinctive and much misunderstood even in America, let alone around the rest of the world. Another feature that struck people was the love of games. Many of the great world games, team games like football and cricket and so on, were invented in England, and at least the rules and the way they were played were adopted in England and then spread around the world. So that the English seemed to be very preoccupied with playing games, which were not just on the football field, but they played games in their parliament, they played games in their law, they played games with their art. It was a playful kind of civilization. Another feature about it was that it was enormously individualistic. Most civilizations, the group came first. You were a member of a family or a village, community, and then that gave you certain position and roles and rights within that group. In England, for peculiar reasons which I investigated in a number of my books, the English were very individualistic. You came first. You were the whole world within yourself. And like Robinson Crusoe on his island, you could make a world on your own, and then other people joined it, most significantly your other self, your partner for life if you did marry or whatever, but also friends, people in clubs, associations. So you built up and constructed webs and networks around yourself, but you were the hub and centre of it all, and that was extremely odd. Another feature which struck people was how litigious and legal based the English were. In most societies I read about as an anthropologist, you settle disputes by informal methods. The ancestors, or at least your seniors in the village or whatever, would settle disputes. So there was very little legal process, no courts, no manuals in most societies. And where there were these things in great civilizations like India, then, or China, then the legal system was very simplified, very brutal, very direct, and there was no great profession of lawyers or solicitors. People didn't have intrinsic legal rights. There was no jury system. You had the use of torture, all sorts of things. And the property law was also very simple, either private or public property. In England, there was a huge emphasis on law. The one thing that one could say was the key to English society was the legal system, and that was unlike anything. The Romans had some of it, though Roman law was very different, but the English took law to its extreme, and that's why when they spread over in the largest empire in world history, the legal systems of England were taken to India and elsewhere and were extremely important. Another thing that struck outsiders and I'd taken for granted was the class system. The English were and are extremely class conscious. That is to say, the infinite gradations which are demarcated by your accent, by your schooling, by your family connections, by your wealth, by your consumption patterns. These have been of perennial interest to the English. They didn't have the kind of formal set distinctions which most societies have between castes, which are absolutely separated, or other kind of social orders. It was much fuzzier. You could move around through the classes. There were ladders up which you could climb or down which you could fall quite easily. but the ladders were very strong. And throughout history, if you look at English literature, for example, from Shakespeare up to Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde and others, or Jane Austen and Dickens and other, a lot of it, much of it, is about class in one way or another. And I realized later that being sent to private boarding schools was a part of trying to set me in a certain path towards a certain social class. And finally, I realized that my religious system was odd. Christianity, of course, is one of the great world religions, but within Christianity, the English had adopted from the Protestant Reformation onwards, and to a certain extent before, an extreme form of it, which at its height in the Puritan period of the later 16th and 17th centuries was the extreme form, not quite as extreme as Calvinism in Scotland, but fairly extreme in that it simplified religion down to its essential, God and yourself, and all the externals, the priests and the prayers and the masses and the rituals, were as much as possible eliminated. So it was a very self-disciplining, simplified, rather ascetic kind of religion, which I grew up in and took for granted, until again I went to Asia and saw how different the religious systems in most of the world is, with much more ritual and spirits and godlings and so on and so on. So basically I learned through my life about myself, about my world, through a kind of participant observation anthropology of my own life, coming to terms with England and then looking at it as an anthropologist should from the outside as a society worth studying, interesting, odd, and rather influential.